At exactly 05:00, before the sun had risen over the dry flats surrounding Kirtland Air Force Base, Lieutenant Rachel Carson was already wide awake. The alarm on her desk buzzed, but she had been up for 15 minutes, lying still in the narrow dorm cot, listening to the hum of the base stirring faintly beyond her wall. She slid out of bed, folded her blanket with the same sharp corners taught in basic, and laced up her boots in practiced silence. The hangar was still locked in darkness when she arrived at 05:21. She used her own keycard, a minor administrative privilege granted for reliability, and stepped into the cool metallic silence. The UH-60L Blackhawk sat parked like giant insects in a row, rotor blades still, fuselages gleaming under dim safety lights. Rachel clipped on her checklist board and began walking the line, her boots echoing softly across the hangar floor. She moved with precision, checking oil levels, inspecting the rotor systems, visually confirming hydraulic line integrity, and testing battery voltage on each aircraft. At 05:47, she pulled herself into the crew compartment of Hawk 21, opened the auxiliary control panel, and tested the backup radios. Static. Reset. Retest. Clear. One by one, she flipped switches, listened, adjusted, logged. By 06:10, she had performed 7 full walkarounds and cross-checked each helicopter's maintenance report with physical inspection. She wiped down the front windshields with a microfiber cloth, checking for tiny spidering cracks, dust residue, or bird impacts. Her gloves never left her hands, and her boots never shuffled. She didn't need to look busy. She was. At 06:32, the rest of the flight crew started trickling in. They moved slower, talking between sips of coffee. Some barely zipped into their flight suits. Captain Brandon Cole was the last to arrive. Tall, loud, confident. Cole tossed his helmet bag onto a bench and gave Rachel a nod that passed more as habit than greeting. She returned it with a quiet, "Good morning, sir," then stepped back from the aircraft she had just finished prepping. Cole gave Hawk 21 a glance and gestured to one of the crew chiefs. "She's clear," the chief pointed to Rachel. "Lieutenant Carson's done a full inspection already." Cole smirked, turning to the others. "Of course she has." A few of the guys chuckled. Rachel stood silently beside the aircraft, hands behind her back, helmet under one arm, waiting for the assignment brief. It had been the same for months. She wasn't hated. She wasn't even disliked. She was just overlooked. To them, she was the overachiever with a clipboard, the one who never missed a maintenance discrepancy, never showed up late, never failed a systems test, and never got into the pilot seat. She'd ranked 3rd across the entire Western Command in T6 Texan 2 simulators last year. Her emergency procedures had been clocked at faster than average reaction. Times, no one seemed to care. At 07:00, the flight assignments were read aloud. Cole was pick again. Rachel, as always, was assigned as backup. Her name was called without emotion, without eye contact, like a formality. She nodded, accepted her tablet, and checked her assignment quietly. Cole gave her a half smile as he slid on his gloves. "Try not to fall asleep back there, Carson." She nodded. "Yes, sir." In that moment, standing near the humming body of the Blackhawk, Rachel didn't feel resentment. She felt readiness. She knew every switch, every startup sequence, every limit indicator on that panel. She could start that bird in her sleep. She had many times, alone in the sim room at night. But here, in daylight, she remained backup. As they loaded gear and moved toward pre-flight briefings, she fell into step behind the others. Not because she had to, because that was the role. For now, no one had to know that she'd memorized every emergency checklist, rehearsed multi-engine failures at max gross weight, or studied every one of Cole's flight patterns. They didn't notice. That was fine. She wasn't waiting for recognition. She was waiting for the day when the sky stopped caring about rank, gender, or who signed the duty roster. The day when only readiness mattered. And she would be. She always was. The lights in the simulator wing dimmed to night cycle at 22:00. Most of the base had gone quiet by then. Crew lounges were dark. Briefing rooms locked. But in Building C, 3rd floor, one access panel beeped open again. Lieutenant Rachel Carson slipped through with a swipe of her personal card and paused, just inside, listening. The hallway was still. She moved fast but careful, walking past unused rooms until she reached Sim Bay 4. Inside was the UH-60L procedural trainer, a high-fidelity simulator used mostly for crew coordination drills and emergency response training. No one had booked the room after 20:00. She'd checked the schedule. She always did. Rachel keyed in the override, entered, and pulled the door shut behind her. By 22:09, she was buckled in the right seat, headset on, engine displays lit, The room echoed faintly with the low hum of hydraulic actuators and cooling. Fans. She flipped through the startup menu, bypassed the standard intro, and selected a custom scenario dual engine failure at max gross weight. She gave herself less than 200 feet of altitude and simulated partial tail rotor damage. It was a nightmare scenario. She ran it 3 times. Each time, she made it farther before impact. At 2312, she switched to a mid-air fire scenario. Fire in engine 1. Systems failure in GPS. Degraded comms. No co-pilot. No crew chief. Just her. She talked through her decision tree aloud. Shutdown number 1. Pull fire handle. Arm extinguisher. Auto-rotate if necessary. Check torque on engine 2. Scan for hard surface LZ. Her hands moved fast, but not frantic. She didn't guess. She knew. By 0:05, Rachel started her last run emergency night landing. Power loss. Over urban terrain. She had less than 10 seconds from warning light to action. She made it with 4 seconds to spare, when the simulator froze on the final screen, showing the aircraft stabilized 80 feet above rooftops in hoverhold. She finally exhaled. She removed her headset and rubbed her face. Her palms were sweating. Her shoulder ached from tension, but she was smiling just a little. These sessions didn't count toward anything official. No one reviewed the logs, but she logged them anyway, by hand. In a black spiral notebook she kept tucked in her locker. Each page had scenario variables, timestamps, and personal notes. No one saw it but her. That was how it had been since the funeral. She had been 23 when her brother, Major Nathan Carson, was killed in action. He had been flying an A-10C Thunderbolt II over northern Iraq, providing close air support for a pinned-down recon unit. A man-pads had clipped his left wing. He stayed on target long enough to clear the ground team, but his ejection was too low. They recovered his remains near the crash site, still strapped in. Rachel had spoken at his service, not to the crowd, just to the coffin. Her voice barely carried in the wind. She said she would keep flying for him, even if she never got wings of her own. She would stay sharp, stay worthy, stay ready. She remembered him coming home on leave in his flight suit, joking about how ugly the A-10 was and how much he loved it anyway. He called it beautiful because it did its job. Rachel used to sneak into his room and read his checklists, copy his notes, ask questions he always answered. When she told him she wanted to fly, he hadn't laughed. He'd said only this: know your bird better than anyone. Then prove it doesn't care who's in the seat, only that someone knows how to keep it flying. Now, 3 years later, she was still proving it. Alone. Every night. She unbuckled, stepped out of the cockpit, and logged her final entry 0047. Returned room to baseline status. No damage. All systems normal. She wiped the controls with a clean cloth, erased her prints from the screens, and powered everything down. By 01:02, she was walking back toward the dorms. Hoodie pulled over her head. The base silent again. The security cameras would show nothing unusual. Just a low-ranking lieutenant checking rooms. No one would notice that she had just completed more combat emergency reps in one night than most active duty pilots did in a month. No one saw her practice. No one watched her train. But Rachel wasn't doing it to be seen. She did it because someday it might matter that she had. The rotor wash pushed dust across the pad as the UH-60L Blackhawk lifted off. From Kirtland at 0842, Captain Brandon Cole had the controls, his hands relaxed, eyes half-lidded behind polarized lenses. Beside him, in the co-pilot seat, Lieutenant Rachel Carson scanned the checklist again, even though she'd memorized it. Their mission was a routine medevac, transporting 2 wounded infantrymen from a remote forward outpost near Red Rock. Nothing about it felt unusual. Cruising at 3,000 feet AGL, Rachel monitored engine torque, oil temps, and comms. Everything was stable. The flight path was familiar. She'd sat back up on this same route 7 times. In the past 4 months, she could have flown it blindfolded. Still, something felt off. At 08:59, she noticed mild static on VHF-1 and flickering on the secondary radio display. "Sir, we're getting intermittent noise across both radios," she said, adjusting the squelch and checking the antenna output. Could be localized interference, but it's not matching standard patterns. Cole glanced at the display, then at the landscape. "Mountains out here bounce signals all the time. Don't let the ghosts in the box rattle you." Rachel said nothing. She rechecked the comm settings, shifted to UHF, and tried the backup frequency. Same flutter, slight lag in data relay. Her gut tightened. By 09:07, she activated the FLIR camera feed and scanned the terrain ahead. Forested ridges sloped steeply on both sides. The flight corridor narrowed as they approached the outpost. She zoomed the image, toggled contrast, and froze the frame. Heat blooms showed up behind tree lines, two distinct sources, stationary, two symmetrical for wildlife, spaced about 150 meters apart, both with defined vertical structure. It didn't look like a campfire or parked vehicle. It looked like a setup. Sir, I'm detecting two thermal anomalies at our 2 o'clock, roughly 1 click southeast. Possible elevated defensive structures or concealed vehicles. Doesn't fit with routine civilian presence. Cole sighed. You're reading shapes into shadows again. Could be maintenance sheds, or our own teams setting up sensor arrays. You think there's a surprise party waiting for us, sir? This stretch has had 2 previous IED incidents and 1 attempted downing in the last 6 months, she said, keeping her tone neutral. All of them started with the same interference patterns we're seeing. Cole tightened his grip on the cyclic, then relaxed it again. Carson, backup pilots don't get promoted by spooking the primary. We've got 2 wounded guys waiting. This is not a war zone. It's a milk run. Rachel swallowed hard. She looked back at the FLIR feed. One of the heat sources had shifted slightly. The outline elongated. The other stayed still. She marked the coordinates manually and logged the observation. No one had asked her to. No one ever did. At 0912, Cole keyed up the radio. Pedro 72 en route, ETA 5 mics, all green. He chuckled, then added, My co-pilot's seeing ghosts today. But we're fine. Someone on the other end laughed. Rachel didn't. She stared out the window, helmet pressed to the side glass. She knew what her brother would have said. Just because no one believes you doesn't make you wrong. Her right hand hovered over the caution panel, fingers memorizing the warning light layout. Just in case. She wanted to say more. But the last time she'd pushed, it had ended with a lecture on knowing her place. So, she stayed quiet, marked the anomalies, kept her voice level, trusted that being ready might count for something, even if she never got the chance to act on it. Outside, the ridgeline got closer. So did something else. At 0916, the first RPG flew past the nose of the Black Hawk so close that the shockwave rocked the cockpit. Rachel flinched, hands gripping her armrests as warning tones shrieked across the instrument panel. A split second later, the second rocket struck the right engine nacelle, sending a burst of flame and metal shards across the crew bay. The helicopter lurched hard to the left. Captain Cole shouted something that cut off when a piece of shattered plexiglass struck his temple. His head slammed forward against the cyclic. Blood splattered the multifunction display, and his body went limp in the seat. Rachel didn't have time to panic. She reached across him and pulled his hand off the stick. The aircraft was dropping fast, tail yawing out of trim, torquey split flashing red. Engine 1 was still pushing power, but Engine 2 was gone. She reached up and pulled the throttle for Engine 2 to idle. Confirmed fire suppression kicked in, then took control. She keyed her mic, voice steady. This is Pedro 72. We're taking fire. Pilot incapacitated, initiating emergency descent. The airframe groaned as she leveled the collective and adjusted pitch to stabilize their glide path. Airspeed was bleeding too fast. She trimmed nose down slightly to regain translational lift, holding it at 80 knots. Altimeter wound down past 1,000 feet. She scanned for an LZ. Below them was a narrow clearing wedged between 2 slopes. Trees clawed at the perimeter. Too tight. No time to look for better. She entered auto-rotation, dropped the collective fully, and feathered the cyclic to control sync rate. Rotor RPM held at the edge of redline. The tail rotor was still responding, but sluggishly. She adjusted pedals, managing yaw just enough to keep the nose aligned. Altitude hit 300 feet. She called back to the crew. Brace for landing. Stay low on impact. Her voice didn't shake. At 120 feet, she pulled collective slowly, trading RPM for lift. The descent slowed. She kept her eyes on the center of the clearing, a patch barely wider than the rotor arc. No rocks, just scrub and grass. At 40 feet, she flared the nose gently, bled off forward speed, and leveled out. The gear hit hard but stable. The main blades flexed, bit into air, and settled. The Black Hawk skidded 2 feet, then stopped. It was 0918. Smoke poured from the right intake. Fire warning lights still glowed, but no secondary explosions. Rachel unbuckled, leaned over Cole, and checked his pulse. It was weak, but steady. She pressed the cabin intercom. We're down. I need a medic to the cockpit now. Outside, the forest echoed with movement. Shadows slipped between trees. More was coming. Rachel stayed in the seat, one hand on the controls, the other wiping blood off her panel. She didn't need orders. She needed to be ready. The forest was quiet, but it wasn't calm. Rachel could hear the distant rustle of boots moving fast through brush. Maybe 200 meters out, Shadows darted between trees just beyond the clearing. She looked down at the damaged console, then back up at the tree line. They didn't have time. The crew compartment was a mess of smoke, busted gear, and triage. One of the medics knelt beside the unconscious Captain Cole, checking his breathing. The two wounded infantrymen were semi-conscious and losing blood. The lead medic, Sergeant Pike, crawled into the cockpit and leaned in close. "What's the plan, Lieutenant?" he asked, low and urgent. "We hold here or make a run for it?" Rachel didn't answer right away. She was scanning the system diagnostics. Engine 1 showed green, rotor RPM stable, hydraulics within range. Armor on the starboard side was compromised, but the bird could still lift. She checked the fuel gauge, 58% remaining. Command finally came through the backup comm line. The voice was strained but clear. "Pedro 7-2. Remain in place. QRF en route. ETA 40 minutes. Do not attempt lift." She keyed the mic and responded, "Copy. Current position under threat. Injured on board. Will reassess in 5. She switched the radio off without waiting for reply. Pike stared at her. "They said wait. I heard them. You gonna..." Rachel looked at him, her voice low. "You know what happens in 40 minutes if they get here first." She didn't need to say who they were. Everyone knew. Another voice called from the back. "This thing's flyable." Rachel turned and stood. "It'll fly. Won't be pretty. Won't be fast. But we can get off the ground and we can move." Pike exhaled. "You sure I've logged more hours in this airframe than anyone on this base? Just not officially." She moved back into the seat, began flipping switches. The whine of systems recharging filled the cabin. One of the medics gave a soft cheer when the panel lights flickered back to life. Outside, the shadows were getting closer. Rachel could hear them now, voices in a language she didn't know, but didn't need to. Sergeant Pike looked around at the others, then back at her. "All right, ma'am, you've already gotten us this far. Let's finish it." Rachel didn't smile. She didn't look relieved. She just nodded once and reached for the collective. The blades began to spin again. She knew this bird. She knew what it could take. And she knew, deep down, no one else was going to get them out of here. Not in time. They had a chance, and she was it. Rachel pushed the Black Hawk into a low climb, trees rushing beneath the skids as the rotor blades cut through rising heat. Behind her, one of the medics shouted to hang on, but she didn't turn. At Aero 927, they were airborne, cleared of the kill zone. Any other pilot would have pressed north toward friendly lines. Rachel banked hard right. The crew looked confused as the helicopter swept back toward the ambush point. Sergeant Pike leaned forward. "Ma'am, we're leaving." "Right." She didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the FLIR display, scanning for movement. Two figures broke from the tree line, one dragging what looked like a launch tube. Rachel marked them, toggled to the weapon systems, and spoke into the intercom. "Right side, M240. You see them?" The door gunner swiveled. "Got 'em." The 7.62mm machine gun barked a controlled burst, kicking dust across the tree line. The two figures dove out of sight. Rachel kept the bird steady, giving the gunner a stable line. A few seconds later, she rotated left and lined up for a second pass. She keyed up the backup comms. "QRF, this is Pedro 7-2. I have eyes on ambush site. Enemy movement confirmed. Transmitting coordinates." She sent the data through encrypted channel B. A voice responded. 7-2. Copy. You engaging affirmative. We're suppressing from altitude. Provide ground advance vector. As she made the second orbit, she dropped to 200 feet AGL and kept speed low. The damaged armor made her vulnerable, but she didn't hesitate. The left side M240 opened up next, targeting muzzle flashes near a rocky outcrop. Rachel adjusted her heading slightly, keeping their angle shallow and their profile tight to the hill. The QRF came back. "We're 6 minutes out. You're clear to soften them." Rachel relayed heading data to the gunner and made another loop. This time, she saw 3 fighters break cover and run toward the ridge. Her voice stayed level, weapons free, short bursts, conserve ammo. Each turn was coordinated, each pass clean. She kept altitude just low enough to stay out of MANPAD's range, but high enough. For Overwatch, it wasn't textbook, but it was smart. The fire teams approaching on foot reported that her suppressive fire had pinned the enemy, making it possible to close without casualties. At Aero 935, she made her final pass. QRF, enemy scattered. Ridge is open. The voice came back clear. "Copy, we've got it from here." Rachel throttled up and turned north, not toward base, but toward the designated evac station for the wounded. She didn't speak for several minutes. No celebration, no commentary. She just flew, because in that moment, she wasn't a backup. She was the one they counted on. The rotors were still winding down when the crew ramp dropped and a wave of ground personnel rushed the pad. Medics moved fast to pull the wounded out, followed by a stretcher team for Captain Cole. Rachel stayed in the cockpit until the last of them had cleared. She powered down the aircraft and stepped off at 10:41, boots hitting concrete as a cheer went up from the flight line. It caught her off guard. Maintenance crew, junior pilots, even some instructors had gathered near the hangar. Someone clapped, others followed. A few officers nodded as she walked past, eyes wide with disbelief that the silent backup had brought home a damaged bird, its entire crew alive. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks but didn't slow down. She didn't smile. There was still too much noise in her chest. At the edge of the crowd, her squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Rains, waited with his arms crossed. He didn't clap. He stepped forward as Rachel approached and gave a curt nod. "Lieutenant Carson, you're relieved of flight duty effective immediately." Her body went still. "Sir, you're being grounded pending investigation. Questions about protocol, chain of command, and unauthorized engagement." The applause behind her faded like someone had pulled a plug. Rachel blinked once. "Sir, I followed emergency response regs under field conditions. I documented you disobeyed a stand-down order. You assumed command without formal designation. You exposed the aircraft to unnecessary risk. I saved lives. I didn't say you didn't, but that's not the point right now." She opened her mouth but stopped. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. Tired in the way people did when something above them had already been decided. He handed her a manila envelope. Inside was the formal grounding order, effective immediately. Flight privileges revoked. Full inquiry pending. By 11:05, she was sitting alone on a bench outside the medbay, flight suit streaked with ash and hydraulic fluid. Her hands were still shaking, not from fear, from fury. Everything she'd trained for, everything she'd practiced at night, everything she'd proven in one impossible hour, it didn't matter. She wasn't praised. She was a liability. Her mind went over the mission again, step by step. Systems check. Rotor stabilization. M240 deployment. Suppression angle. QRF handoff. She didn't miss anything. She'd done everything right. Except one thing. She wasn't the one who was supposed to make that call. Rachel stared at the envelope in her lap. Her name typed in block letters across the front. It felt heavier than it should, like all the weight of being prepared but never chosen had finally dropped in. Her hands. She had saved her team. And this was what she got. A seat on the ground and silence. The base library was nearly empty by 1922. Rachel sat alone in a far corner, back straight, sleeves rolled up. Her notebook sat open beside a stack of printed regulations. Her eyes scanned each page with methodical focus, flipping only when she had underlined key phrases. She wasn't looking for vindication. She was looking for truth. Regulation 197C, Emergency Flight Command Transfer. Subsection B, in any instance where the designated pilot in command becomes incapacitated, a qualified secondary aviator may assume full control of the aircraft, provided immediate action is required to preserve life, prevent loss of military assets, or complete a mission of vital urgency. Rachel highlighted the sentence and circled the clause documented. Qualification? She flipped to her simulation records. Self-logged, unofficial, but time-stamped and detailed. Hours of auto-rotation drills, emergency landings, mid-air failure tests. She had trained for this, alone and unseen. She cross-referenced the base's own flight SOPs. Nowhere did it prohibit what she had done. It only failed to anticipate someone like her would ever need to. At 21:03, she walked into the legal affairs office with a printed binder in hand. The JAG officer looked surprised to see her. "Lieutenant Carson, I heard you were off the flight roster." Rachel nodded once. "I'm not contesting that, but I am requesting a review under Reg 197C. I've compiled the evidence that shows I acted within scope." She placed the binder on his desk. Inside were flight logs, emergency protocols, digital overlays of the ambush site, and annotated comms recordings. She included a handwritten appendix of warnings ignored over the past 6 months, FLIR anomalies, signal disruptions, and dismissed reports. Each one signed, each one unanswered. The officer flipped through the material slowly. "You prepared all of this yourself?" "Yes, sir." "Why didn't you come forward sooner? I wasn't in command." "Not officially. People only listen after." The next day, she was called into a review session. 3 officers, 1 civilian counsel. Rachel stood at attention, her voice steady as she walked through every step of the mission. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask for praise. She asked for accuracy. By the time she finished, no one interrupted. One colonel asked for clarification on rotor torque limits under partial engine failure. She quoted it by memory. Another asked how she knew when to flare. She cited descent speed, terrain contour, and visual markers. Every answer was calm, measured, sharp. No one praised her. No one apologized. But they listened. For the first time, they truly listened. She left the room with her binder tucked under her arm, still grounded, still waiting. But the weight in her chest felt lighter. Not because she'd won, because she'd finally been heard. The courtroom at Kirtland AFB was small, stripped of ceremony. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above polished floors. At 09:00, the tribunal convened. 3 senior officers sat at the bench. The flags of the United States and the Air Force stood behind them, motionless. Rachel stood at the defendant's table in full service dress, her binder of evidence perfectly squared on the table's edge. The JAG prosecutor opened with a clean summary. Lieutenant Carson willfully disobeyed a direct order to remain grounded and engaged hostile forces without authorization. We acknowledge her bravery, but this hearing is about order, not outcome. There were no murmurs, no reactions, just note-taking. The first witness was Captain Brandon Cole, still bandaged but seated upright. He gave a stiff recount of the mission, noting that he had no memory after the second RPG hit. When asked if he trusted Rachel's judgment prior to that moment, he hesitated. She was competent, quiet, but she wasn't command. Rachel didn't flinch. The defense called Sergeant Pike next. He spoke with clipped certainty. If she hadn't flown, we'd be dead. She made every call by the book, sir. She just didn't wait for permission to save our lives. He added that none of them were qualified to pilot, and that Rachel had calmly briefed the crew while under fire. No exaggeration, just facts. Next came the legal debate. The prosecutor referenced Air Force Instruction 11202, Article 5, 6 on chain of command. Assuming control without explicit designation is a breach. Rachel's counsel responded by citing Regulation 197C, emergency command transfer. The courtroom grew tense as they debated interpretation was Rachel's. Assumption of command truly immediate and life-preserving, or could they have waited for the QRF? Rachel was finally called to the stand at 10:48. She took her seat without a paper in front of her. The presiding officer asked her directly, "Lieutenant, did you disobey a direct order?" "Yes, sir. I received a stand-down order. I chose not to follow it. Why? Because we were already being flanked. The captain was unconscious. We had 2 wounded and low visibility. Waiting meant risking all of them. I judged that the aircraft was flight capable, and I had the training to get them out." "Were you officially recognized as PIK node, sir?" "I was the only conscious pilot. I made the call because no one else could." They asked her about the enemy engagement. She gave tactical details, grid overlays, suppression angles, and timing. She described each pass over the tree line with controlled precision. Her voice never rose. She didn't shift blame. She didn't ask for recognition. Then came the final question. "Lieutenant, do you believe you acted within the spirit of your training and duty?" "Yes, sir. I believe we're trained to preserve life, to protect our team, and to respond when seconds matter. I did that." There was no applause. No one leaned forward. But the silence afterward was thick with unspoken shift. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every quiet, qualified backup who'd been told to wait. She returned to her seat, her binder untouched, her jaw set. The verdict hadn't been read yet, but the room already felt different. The tribunal reconvened at 16:00. The room was still, the air thick with anticipation. Rachel stood again, heels together, eyes forward. She didn't move, didn't shift, didn't glance at the others seated behind her. Sergeant Pike was there. So was Cole, arms folded. A few flight instructors sat in the back. No one spoke. The presiding officer, a brigadier general with 30 years in the air, read from a prepared document. In the matter of Lieutenant Rachel Carson, after full review of field logs, operational footage, and testimony under Article 32, this panel finds the actions taken on 14th of March to be within acceptable parameters of Regulation 197C. In light of emergency conditions and incapacitation of the commanding pilot, Lieutenant Carson acted in accordance with immediate preservation of life. Protocol. There was a pause. Rachel didn't breathe. "You are hereby cleared of all charges of insubordination. Your flight status is reinstated effective immediately." A quiet exhale came from the back. Someone whispered, "She did it." The general continued, "In recognition of exceptional judgment, composure under fire, and preservation of life without loss of aircraft, you are awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Additionally, this tribunal recommends immediate review of designation standards for emergency pilot succession." Rachel blinked once. That was all. Outside the courtroom, the sunlight was harsh, reflecting off the concrete. Pike caught up to her at the stairs, clapping a hand on her shoulder. Didn't think regs would ever work in our favor? She gave a quiet nod. They worked today. Captain Cole approached, more reserved. You flew like someone who'd done it before. He hesitated. I should have seen that earlier. Rachel didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The base bulletin went out the next morning. A revised emergency command clause, now including clarified thresholds for junior aviators assuming temporary command during combat scenarios. The amendment was titled Carson Directive 1A. She didn't ask for it. It came anyway. The next time she entered the hangar, more heads turned. The crew didn't stare through her anymore. A junior pilot from another squadron approached her near the T6 sim bay. Ma'am, if you ever have time, I'd like to run night scenarios with you. You've got the best flight instincts I've ever seen. Rachel smiled. Just barely. It's not instinct. It's practice. She logged her next solo flight on March 20th at 0502. No one questioned her clearance. No one checked her clipboard. She did her walk around like always, thorough, silent, calm. The sky didn't feel different. But she did. And that was enough. By the time the next quarter rolled in, Lieutenant Rachel Carson's name was no longer followed by pauses or sideways, glances. She had been reassigned not as punishment, not as consolation, but with purpose. At 0745 on her first day in the new role, she unlocked the door to Building F, the old classroom wing most pilots ignored. A new placard had been bolted just beneath the squadron seal. Tactical Readiness and Emergency Response, Flight Section Lead Lut R. Carson. The first course she developed was called Critical Command Transfer. Readiness in the Gray Zone. It was built from her notes, her unofficial logs, and the gaps she had lived through. The syllabus wasn't flashy. No hero speeches. Just structured reps, deep emergency modeling, and the brutal realism of being second in command until the second turned to none. By week 3, 21 backup pilots had cycled through her class. Each one ran solo blackout drills. They practiced tail rotor failures in crosswind, failed FLIR sweeps under enemy fire, and radio degradation under mountain signal loss. Rachel taught them how to trust systems but not rely on them, how to speak up without panicking, how to document everything, even when no one was listening yet. Her voice in the classroom was the same as it had been in the cockpit. Low, clear, direct. She didn't tell stories. She built memory through muscle and repetition. By the end of the first training cycle, readiness test scores had improved by 32%. Median response times during combat simulation dropped by nearly 2 full minutes. In a profession where seconds meant lives, those minutes changed the curve. Command took notice. At the spring readiness briefing, the 19th Airlift Wing Commander paused during his address to mention a new standard. We've seen measurable reductions in hesitation and faster, on-the-ground calls from crews trained under Lieutenant Carson's readiness system. It's what we now refer to informally as the Morgan Standard, named after the outpost where she made the call no one else could. Rachel didn't react much when she heard it. The title was irrelevant. The shift in tone wasn't. Senior officers who used to glance over her now called her into consults. They wanted to know what she saw on those FLIR screens, what instincts she trusted, how she knew to act when the doctrine said to wait. She didn't frame her answers in big terms. She talked about checklists, training hours, accountability logs. When someone asked how she could stay so composed, she said, "Fear comes second. First is focus. The impact spread fast." A reserve unit in Nevada requested access to her emergency protocols. 2 A-10 squadrons on the East Coast adopted her silent command handoff. Drill. A Navy liaison requested joint training. She never sought the spotlight, but her curriculum spread because it worked, because people who hadn't been heard before saw themselves in it. And it wasn't just numbers that changed. It was the room. In squadron lounges, junior pilots started asking better questions. Flight chiefs stopped brushing off anomaly reports. When a flight engineer in her late 20s flagged an irregular vibration, pattern during an engine check, no one laughed. They grounded the aircraft. The issue saved a crew 5 days later. Rachel heard about it in a short, 3-line email. She saved it. She kept flying too. She rotated into medevac standby twice a month, logged regular cockpit hours, and stayed current in 3 different rotary platforms. But she never stopped teaching. Her classes filled faster every cycle. Some students brought old notebooks to show her ones they'd started keeping. After her tribunal, inspired by the quiet way she'd proven the value of their eyes and their instincts, by the 1-year mark, an internal Air Force memo listed Rachel Carson's command succession protocol as a case study for leadership development across 3 branches. The document didn't romanticize her actions. It showed the margin of seconds, the logic behind her decisions, and the exact conditions under which command could and should transfer. The lesson was clear sometimes. Readiness wasn't about rank. It was about who was truly ready. Rachel sat alone one evening at the back of the hangar, watching the sun bleed down over the ridgeline. A young pilot approached quietly and sat beside her. She didn't ask why. After a while, he said, "Do you think it's ever enough?" Doing it right once, Rachel looked straight. Ahead? No, but it's a start, and it makes the next right decision easier for someone else. She didn't speak again. The rotor blades of a nearby UH-60 spun gently and idle, their hum steady, like breath. She'd never expected the work to be seen, but now it was being lived. The memorial wall stood just outside the western edge of the base. Past the hangars and down a gravel path few walked without a reason. Rachel arrived at 0612 just after sunrise. The light cut through the morning haze, gold and soft, casting long shadows across the polished stone. She walked alone, hands in her jacket pockets, not rushing. The wall wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. Rows of etched names filled the dark surface, each one shallow but permanent. Rachel stopped 3 rows down, 7 names from the left. Major Kyle Carson. The letters were clean, still sharp. She reached out, fingertips brushing the groove of the sea like it might carry his voice back. She stood there in silence for a long time. Then she spoke, barely above a whisper. They changed the protocols. Kyle, they named a policy after me. She gave a quiet, brief breath that was almost a laugh. Can you believe that no one answered? Just the quiet breeze through the pines. I used to think I was just training for you. Like if I worked hard enough, I could carry your flight plan forward. But it turned into something else. I had to fly for people who never even knew your name. And now, they'll have a better chance to come home. She shifted her weight, eyes scanning the horizon. I still remember what you said before your last mission. That real strength is knowing when to move without permission. I didn't get it then. I do now. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded printout. It was a photo, her flight log, her simulation records, and a snapshot of the squad she now trained. She placed it gently at the base of the wall, tucked just under the edge of the concrete so it wouldn't blow away. I wish you'd seen them fly, she said. Some of them remind me of you, but quieter. Like me. Her fingers hovered over his name one more time. She didn't cry. She didn't break. That wasn't how she mourned. Rachel's grief had always been motion, practice, precision. And now, memory turned into something usable. She stepped back, gave a small nod, then turned down the path. The light behind her caught the stone just right, casting Kyle's name into shadow, then back into full relief. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. He was always in the sky anyway. The training facility was quiet after hours. Flight manuals were stacked in loose piles, and the hum of overhead fluorescence buzzed against the stillness. Rachel stood by the simulator console, logging the day's results when Cadet Thompson approached, clutching a notebook, brows furrowed like he'd been working up the nerve to speak. He stopped a few feet away, shifting his weight. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" Rachel looked up, her voice even. "Of course." He hesitated, then said, "Do you ever regret it all those years being backup? Not getting noticed?" She closed the binder slowly, set it on the desk, and leaned back against the console. Her eyes stayed on his, calm, thoughtful. "No, I don't regret it," she said, "because that's where I learned the most. In silence, watching everything, preparing for a moment I didn't even know was coming." He looked down. "But you should have been led years ago. Maybe not." She paused. Being overlooked hurts, but it also strips you down. You stop doing it for praise, you start doing it right, because it has to be done right. He nodded slowly. Unsure, Rachel continued. "A backup isn't someone who wasn't good enough. A backup is someone trusted to take over when everything's falling apart, when no one has time to explain, when seconds decide who walks away and who doesn't." She pushed off the console, walking a slow half circle around the sim bay. "I didn't ask for that moment. I didn't campaign for it. I earned it by being ready, quietly, day after day." Thompson looked up again. "So it wasn't wasted," Rachel gave the barest smile. "None of it was. Every hour I logged alone. Every time I was told to stay back, that's what let me stand up when it mattered. It shaped me." She stepped closer and rested a hand on the edge of the console beside him. "Don't ever confuse backup with second best. The ones who wait are sometimes the only reason anyone else gets home." The cadet's jaw set a little firmer, eyes clear now. He didn't say anything more. He just nodded once, tighter this time, then walked back toward the locker row without another word. Rachel stayed behind, the room empty again. She looked at the sim seat, worn, scuffed, nothing remarkable, and knew it had trained a dozen quiet leaders. Ones no one wrote about, ones who'd never make headlines. And that was the point. Backup didn't mean less. It meant ready, and ready meant everything. There was never a ceremony for the moment Rachel became a leader. No ribbon was cut, no spotlight turned. It just happened in the blur between instinct and necessity, in a cockpit full of smoke. In seconds no one else could afford to lose. She didn't ask for command. She prepared for the moment it might be needed. That's what leadership is. Not permission, not rank, but readiness. Readiness isn't loud. It doesn't seek recognition. It shows up early. It stays late. It watches, learns, sharpens. And when the call finally comes, when the lead falls silent, it steps forward. Without hesitation, Rachel's story is about more than one pilot. It's about the quiet ones, the ones waiting, not to be noticed, but to be useful, to be worthy, to be ready when it matters. Because in the end, medals tarnish, applause fades, but lives saved they stay. Choices made in chaos echo longer than ceremony. So, if you remember anything from her journey, let it be this. You don't have to be in charge to lead. You just have to stay ready. That's all that matters.